I am Mohammad Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another session of our weekly Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series. At the outset, I like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach and learn on their ancestral homeland. I'd like to welcome Dr. Maziar Faridi, our speaker today, to the University of Toronto, of course, virtually. Dr. Faridi is a comparative literature scholar and assistant professor of English and global cinema at Clemson University. He received his Ph.D. in comparative literature from Northwestern University in 2020. He was the recipient of the 2020-2021 Charles Bernheimer Prize for Best Dissertation from the American Comparative Literature. His forthcoming book, Rhythms of Relation, Decolonizing Identity in Iranian Modernism, offers a critique of sovereignty and identity at the intersection of Iranian and global modernism in the 20th century. Dr. Faridi is an alumnus of the Paris Program in Critical Theory, a joint initiative of Northwestern University and the new Sorbonne University. Today, Dr. Faridi will be speaking on Hauntologies of the Present, Notes on Politics of Friendship in Férydoun Rahnéma's Modernism. Please join me to welcome Professor Faridi to the Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. Professor Faridi.
Thank you so very much. And let me begin by thanking Professor Tawakkoli Targhi and the Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto for extending this invitation. And also, I want to thank everybody for joining us on a Friday afternoon. So I want to say a few words. Let me share my screen first. Okay. So I want to say a few words before starting my presentation about the context, the context of this presentation. My monograph reads closely a selection of texts, specifically poems and films, to theorize an anti-sovereign poetics that I argue emerged in tension with political modernity at the intersection of Iranian and global modernism between 1922 and 1979. My presentation today draws on the third chapter of my monograph, although we were just discussing it, and I may turn just this section on Rahnéma into a separate book, because this chapter has become quite a monstrous chapter. It's over 80 pages long. And so the chapter came out first in my dissertation in 2020. Some sections of that chapter will come out as a separate article, and the rest goes into the book. Okay, so what I have prepared for today has two parts. The first part looks at the poetic articulation of a notion of friendship as haunting in Rahnéma's early poetry. And then the second part thinks about the ways in which this notion of friendship as haunting was metamorphized through the technology of film. For this section, I will read parts of my discussion on the film Sīyāvash dar Takht-e Jamshīd. Okay, let me also time myself. I think the presentation will be roughly around 30 minutes. So I hope that feel free to take a nap in between. It's absolutely fine. All right. So I'm not going to discuss exactly who Férydoun Rahnéma was. I'm sure many of the people who are here are familiar with him. He grew up in Beirut and spent much of his adult life in Paris, where he became also acquainted with French modern poetry, specifically the poetry of Paul Eluard. And in fact, his early poetry collections, one of which I'm going to discuss today, Ode à la Perse, Ode au Monde, were published through Eluard's friend and a famous publisher of modernist mid-20th century poetry in France, and that is Pierre Séguer. The first two books were highly political. They were communist poetry, and they were published under a pen name. And Rahnéma's pen name was Kaveh Tabarestani in these two books. And the two other selections of poetry, which are longer, Poème ancienne and Chant de délivrance, they are much more surrealist. They are much more experimental in the way that he approaches the metric system and also his prose poetry in French. And then we mostly know Rahnéma through his films. And Takht-e Jamshīd, Persepolis from 1960, Sīyāvash dar Takht-e Jamshīd in 1965, and Pesar Iran az Madarash bi Etelaz, which came out between 1972 and 3. There was a screening. There's a whole complex history about this film. I want to do also something else. Before starting my presentation, I want to give you further readings about Rahnéma. And these are just some more recent, let's say, studies on Rahnéma. One is the famous social history of Iranian cinema by Professor Nafisi, and in which he discusses the institutional, specifically focuses on the institutional influence of Férydoun Rahnéma on a generation of Iranian filmmakers. The other one is an excellent close reading of the last film by Rahnéma, Pesar Iran az Madarash bi Etelaz. This is Professor Saljugh's Burning Visions. This is her doctoral dissertation, Burning Visions, the Iranian New Wave and the Politics of the Image, in which she focuses on the questions of intermediality in the context of this film. The other one is another PhD dissertation by Farhad Honarpishe, came out in 2016, in which there is a close reading of the questions of authenticity, in Rahnéma's films, and the chapter of Honarpishe focuses on Persepolis. And it's a very interesting close reading of Persepolis. My take of Persepolis is very different, and again, my close reading really works toward that anti-authenticity and goes very much against the discourses of authenticity in which Honarpishe situates Rahnéma's cinema. Golberg Professor Rekab Talai's book is also an excellent discussion of the historical context of Rahnéma's cinema, but also his influence in on the formation of what we call alter cinema, a kind of alternative cinema and cinematic language in the 1960s. And the last one is my own dissertation, which is becoming a book. Okay, now let me read. Writing in Paris, away from home in French, which was not his quote-unquote mother tongue, and under a pseudonym, Férydoun Rahnéma begins the prologue to his poem Ode au Monde, Ode to the World, 1955, with a celebratory announcement about the time of the world, the time of the world. À présent, il est temps de chanter le monde. Now, at the present moment, it is time to sing the world, he announces. In the rapidly expanding post-war competition of the East and the West, Rahnéma's poem heralds the possibility for the unification of a universal revolutionary class through the call of Marx and Engels, to remind the reader of the arrival of the time to unite internationally, of an international friendship predicated upon the identity of various oppressed nations, seems to be the solemn task of the poem. The young Rahnéma, of course, was not the only poet of his generation to herald the arrival of the quote-unquote proper time of the world. In fact, the golden age of the international modernist poetry of the 1930s to 1950s was already in decline. And yet, the Cold War produced a new wave of socialist poets, especially from the so-called peripheries of the West, that were haunted by a certain Marxist spirit of internationalism. In the Iranian context, as a filmmaker and a poet, Rahnéma played a pivotal role in rethinking the problematic of national identity vis-a-vis such internationalism. And now I'm going to read parts of my close reading of Ode à la Perse. This is his first chapbook published in early 1950s, 1951. Rahnéma's Ode à la Perse commemorates the Iranian resistance against imperialism and colonialism and situates this struggle on the broader map of the international communist movements. From heroes of the constitutional revolution, such as Sattar Khan in Tabriz of early 20th century Iran, to the foreign colonizations of oil fields in Abadan and the struggle of the for nationalization of the oil industry, and the birth of the first Iranian communist movement, the poem judiciously sutures, and I'm putting emphasis on judiciously precisely because justice is a key term in this chapter. The poem judiciously sutures various instances of anti-imperialist resistance in Iran to cases of international struggle from Stalingrad to Greek and French resistance, anti-fascist resistances. Even in his early poetry, Rahnéma shows a keen interest in the technique of montage, which he later cherishes in his theory and practice of cinema. The poetic persona, and this is the beginning of the poem, starts its story at night and finishes it by promising the dawn. And you can see the French, and I'm going to just read my reading, and I'm not going to read the poems. In the metaphoric reign of night and silence, the poem takes upon itself to lend its voice to the past, present, and future of its people, an act through which it articulates a people and simultaneously open the eyes of the quote-unquote French listener, the addressee of the poem, to the light of a universal humanism. The end of the poem is to herald the coming of the dawn, that is to say, the realization of certain metaphysical humanism. The path to what the poem calls true fraternity is through a unifying act of recalling, and the French word that is repeated often is rappeler, the sacrifice of the other. But this remembrance, which wishes to constitute a unified collective identity, requires a common language. Thus, the lyric persona, rendering in French an account of the sacrifice and martyrdom of its comrades, from Taghi Arani to Gabriel Péry, enunciates the desire to create a unified common language for recalling the memory of the other's sacrifice. In a section devoted to one of the prominent figures of the communist movement in Iran, Taqi Arani, the lyric persona addresses and in the act of addressing conjures up Arani's ghost as a martyr. In this conjuration, also a form of mourning, the poetic eye presents its whole language. Je voudrais te donner toute ma langue, to let the absent other haunt the language of the poem. The act of giving language, allowing the absentee to haunt one's language and brain, is to unify what the poem calls the shattered heart of the poetic persona, and a humanity later on in the other stanza, in the next stanza, a humanity that is scattered. The possibility of radical justice in Rahnéma's early works emerges precisely in the act of giving, donner, one's body and language to the wordless and worldless others. This sense of poetic commitment and justice in Rahnéma's poetry is haunted by Paul Eluard's notion of poésie engagée. Poésie engagée. In a radio piece titled Poetry is Contagious from 1949, published after his death in Le Sentier et le Route de la Poésie, 1954, Eluard announces, "We are the committed poets, for all men who respect themselves are engaged with their brothers of the past, with their brothers of today, with their brothers of the future. Poetry works toward the reign of justice," end quote. Central to Eluard's characterization of poésie engagée is fraternity, a relation with, or more precisely, a commitment to those, albeit problematically always the gendered brothers, who are no more and those who are yet to come. The bonding with the ghosts of the past and future makes possible justice in the living present of the poet. But the economy of this gift requires closer examination. In the above apostrophe, the poetic persona presents its language to Arani's ghost, and with this present, the poem recalls to the present the absent addressee of the gift. This gifting of language is the gift of remembrance and souvenir, the poet's gift to the poem's addressee. Despite the desire to recall to presence, embedded in the structure of the gift is an absence in at least two distinct senses. Souvenir as an object promises a synecdochic relation between a token and a whole, and ipso facto, in its representational function, an originary absence of the whole is inscribed. Furthermore, as Derrida also argues in Given Time, Counterfeit Money from 1992, for the gift to be a gift, there needs to be an absence of any recognition of the giftness of the gift, either by the giver or the receiver. As soon as the gift is recognized as such, it becomes part of an economy of reciprocity, return, exchange, countergift, and eventually debt. An absence or forgetfulness needs to be at work for the gift to exist. The gift in Rahnéma's poem becomes the impossible, not only because the doni, namely in this case Arani's ghost, has to succumb to a state of death, but also because the event of presenting language, the whole language as a gift, the divine gift of name and common language, is already itself a return out of responsibility. And later on, the word that he repeats in Ode au Monde is devoir. There's a sense of devoir or responsibility for Arani's act of self-sacrificing for the common, what Alain Badiou characterizes as the final destiny of any communist poetry, quote, all in the singular, end quote. In other words, the original event of the gift is set before the poem in Aronni's sacrifice. Therefore, the gift of language is already inscribed in an economic debt and reciprocity. Furthermore, a major question remains. What does it mean to give or present language? Is language a property to be possessed and then given? What is the ethics of interiorizing the other in such a way that one can give language to this absent other? These questions remain unanswered. And the end of the poem, as it says, to break away from the quote-unquote civilisation marchande, and as promised, is bound to economic relations. I want to move forward from this close reading of the poem, and again, as I mentioned, these are just fragments and sections of this longer chapter, but very much tied to this notion of gift and presenting this absent other. In his early poetry is a notion of an authentic now, an authentic present, without which there could be no gift of identity. Eventually, the aim is to unify a revolutionary class. And in the context of Ode au Monde, I want to just focus on the prologue and maybe just one line from the book, and then move on to the discussion of his cinema. The prologue to Ode au Monde opens with an epigraph from Mao Tse, calling our attention to the importance of today. This is the epigraph from Rahnéma's Ode au Monde. C'est seulement aujourd'hui qu'il y a des hommes de corps. It is only today that there are men of heart. The epigraph comes from one of Mao's most anthologized poems, Snow, from 1936, translated into French by Jeanine Méthode from Robert Paine's English rendition, and published by, again, Segel in 1949. Composed during Mao's first air travel, the poem reflects on the ravishing beauty of an ancient land over which many sovereigns have ruled. None, however, the poem tells us, knew how to appreciate its beauty. The poem ends by pointing out that all those crude rulers are gone, and it is only today that there are men of feeling, or alternatively, men of character. The last two lines of Mao's poem have been interpreted differently. Jeanine's and Paine's renditions both underline the element of feeling and an affective aspect. In most translations of these lines, nevertheless, one distinction is evident. The poem distinguishes between the past, that is to say the feudal past, and the present. And in this rupture, attaches a sense of authenticity to the poetic now. Beyond its haunting reverberation among the avant-garde writers and artists, as sketched by Marjorie Perloff as well, the idea of a profound aujourd'hui finds a new life thanks to the committed literature of resistance and decolonial literature during and after the Second World War. The significance of this epigraph and Rahnéma's emphasis throughout the poem on an authentic self-present present or self-present now as a gift becomes evident, especially when read against his shift to the past in his later films. Okay, so I want to move on now to the discussions of his films, and something happens in between. Rahnéma returns to Iran during this time in the early 50s. And because of his health, he was also most of the time he was bedridden. And this is the time that a group of Iranian young intellectuals and poets specifically, they approach Rahnéma, and among whom Morteza Keyvan and Ahmad Shamlu are the most well-known people. And something happens at this moment. Immediately after these, after he wrote these poems, and even though Ode au Monde was published in 1955, he wrote it after Ode à la Perse in 1951 and 1952. And what happens is the 1953 coup, in which the democratic government of Mohammad Mossadegh is toppled. And just like Shamlu and many other poets of that generation, there's not simply a rupture, but there is a transformation. All these ideas and ideals of a revolutionary class to come, and this now with all these potentialities, this ontological notion of the present, with all this potential, the telos of history toward an absolute humanism. All this is now actually shattered, and now all these intellectuals, poets, writers, filmmakers are also dealing with the fact of the 1953 coup. Rahnéma originally wrote Siavash for theater, but eventually decided to turn it into a film. What most probably persuaded Rahnéma to turn this project into his first feature film is his interest in the potentials of montage and editing. It is indeed through processes of editing that Rahnéma is best able to develop his vision of the bond between past and present, as well as the spectral interruptions of the present. Far from an extravagant epic film, Rahnéma's adaptation features a non-linear form that aims at disjointing the spectator's experience of time and space. The main characters of the film, Sīyāvash, Sūdabē, Keykavus, and Afrasiab, later joined by Pharangiz, appear to us as specters wandering aimlessly among the ruins of Persepolis, and debating different aspects of the story of Sīyāvash. These mythical figures are treated as historical figures resurrected from the dead, haunting the ruins of Persepolis. I'm going to let this just play. The conversations of the specters at the very beginning of the film is interrupted by a car that arrives at the site and from which a film crew appears. As the staff walk off screen, we hear them referring to our ghosts as artists enacting historical events. On the other side of the screen, the sight of the car provokes a conversation among the specters about whether the world has changed or life is still the same, and where exactly the border lies between illusion and reality. Our specters do not agree among themselves. Against Sūdabē, who believes that the world has changed and so have the thoughts of the people, Keykavus argues that the people are still occupied with the same questions and that history is a repetitive story. And Siavash maintains that what haunts the people, quote, is and is not an illusion, just like us. Everybody knows we do not exist, and still we exist, end quote. We are enchanted by specters that always in tension between themselves are neither purely absent nor present. The conversation soon turns into a dispute between Sūdabē and Keykavus on whether one can and should pursue whatever one desires. The scene is then cut to a different setting where we learn about the story of how Keykavus, against the advice of his companions, falls in love with Sūdabē, the daughter of the hostile king of Hamavarân. This is the first of many intercuts interrupting the narration of the story of Sīyāvash. Throughout the film, as the camera tracks the specters wandering slowly among the ruins of Persepolis and conversing about the tragedy of Siavash, frequent cuts transport us to a different time and space where fragments of Shahnameh's story of Siavash are being played out. This movement occurs between what might be immediately supposed to be at a quote-unquote present time, albeit always already haunted by the specters, and a mythical time. Rahnéma bridges the two through certain forms of editing. A striking example of Rahnéma's use of binding montage and jump cuts immediately follows the above conversation between Keykavus and Sudabeh. The conversation morphs into a question about Afrasiyab's personal motivation to break the treaty or the peace treaty and to violate the border between Iran and Turan. The violation of the geopolitical border is then visually sutured to the trespassing of the border between a mother and her son through what in Sergei Eisenstein's theory might be referred to as an example of intellectual montage. Rahnéma creates this bond by cross-cutting a miniature shot from the supposed mythical border between Iran and Turan and a shot of Siavash slowly walking toward his stepmother or mother, depending on which script of Shahnameh you're looking at. As Siavash reaches Sudabeh through jump cuts and, As Siavash reaches Sudabeh through jump cuts and what appears to be a freeze frame, we transition from this montage sequence back to the present world. Although Siavash, as the focal subject of this transition, seemingly creates a sense of graphic continuity, the jarring jump cuts literally cut the figure of Siavash from one setting and paste him into another. Such deterritorialization disjoints the spectator's experience of spatio-temporal continuity as it relates the past and present, the mythical Persia, and the modern ruins of Persepolis. In other words, the form of editing, while dissolving the presupposed border between the past and present myth and history, interrupts the flow of present and ruptures the imagined continuity that also, we need to remember, defines not only the identity of the present with itself, but also a political narrative of national history and continuity. The relationship between the two worlds is not antithetical, and the film does not follow a dialectical progression. They are rather interdependent. The specters aimlessly wandering among the ruins of Persepolis already signal an anastomosis of myth and history. The forceful flow of present remains haunted and often violently interrupted by the mythical, and the mythical fragments find an opening for re-emergence only insofar as they are in relation to the context that the specters provide for their deeds and words in the present continuous of the film. In other words, if one world is a world more or less faithful to the fragments of Ferdowsi's text, the other is a world where the specters within a modern framework often provide contradictory interpretations as well as context to this text, that is to say, the story or the tragedy of Siavash. Rather than exhausting or foreclosing the possibility for multiple meanings, these contexts multiply the interpretations to the extent that a final meaning becomes impossible. And in my book project, I have situated this in a poetics that emerged in early 20th century Iran. We can discuss this later on, maybe during the Q&A. None of these worlds can therefore claim sovereignty over nor total isolation from the other. let me also pause here. Henri Corbin has a detailed reading of this film and precisely this relation of the two worlds. And in my chapter, I have critiqued what seems to be a historical subjectivity, a historical consciousness that is attached or is considered to be the driving force of the film. Now I'm approaching the closing part of my presentation. In his thesis, Le réalisme du film, 1957, Rahnéma discusses Eisenstein's notion of montage, arguing that, quote, his montage of attraction is in fact not that different from the surrealist collage of poetic images and phrases. The more distant the shots are from each other, the more explosive and striking their potentials, end quote. Nonetheless, Rahnéma believes that the explosive, this so-called explosive power of poetic conjoining in poetry as well as in cinema should not erode the sovereignty of every single image or word. And he's talking about both poetry and film, and that is quite interesting. And I've written about that as well. Every word, read also as shot, every word has an aura. And here he's referencing Eisenstein. And when it comes into relation with another word, it should not ruin the sovereignty. And the word that he uses also in his Persian translation of his thesis is farman ravai. It should not ruin the sovereignty of the other, end quote. The sovereignty of each single image, Rahnéma further explains, extends beyond and should not be reduced into the objects depicted on the screen. In fact, he commends the movement of cinema, thanks to the creative force of montage and editing, toward, quote, the emancipation of the image from the humble task of depicting, end quote. There's a paradox at work in Rahnéma's discussion of montage. The paradox is in the interplay of the emancipation of a shot from the function of immediately representing what is on the screen and the preserving of the sovereignty of every single shot. If a shot is in a differential relationship with another or a cluster of other shots, a relation that emancipates it from the task of representing the objects immediately on the screen, already the phantom of the other shots, shots from the past, but also shots to come, haunts the coming and passing of every shot. In other words, the memory of the other spills over onto the shot with which it is juxtaposed. In an analog film, even at the level of a single shot, that is to say, in between a space of the two cuts, where a series of still frames are put into relation with each other and resurrected through the apparatus, it is the difference of one frame from the other that produces the effect of movement through time. A passing frame is always already haunted by the past and the future, a haunting that produces movement. Contrary to Rahnéma's formulation, this undermines the notion of sovereignty or farman ravai of the shot. What seems to replace Rahnéma's notion of the sovereignty in his practice, in the actual practice of montage, is a notion of the singularity, the notion of the singularity of the shot. And by singularity, I'm referring specifically to a recent reformulation of the term singularity by Sam Weber. Rahnéma's point about the explosive power of montage, therefore, can be rephrased as to explode through relation without the singularity of the shots being consumed by relation or montage. Although Rahnéma here seemingly adopts the Soviet film school's doctrine in which montage essentially functions through oppositional signs, in practice he remains hesitant toward the idea of a dialectics in the sense that there is an eventual off-haven, an emotional or intellectual sublation as a result of juxtaposing shots. In Siavash, montage often results in a prevailing sense of ambiguity because it undermines the imagined borders between past and present, myth and history, reality and illusion, always drawing our attention to the materiality of film as a medium. The worlds that Rahnéma aims to conjoin are interdependent, always already in tension in themselves and with the other. Just as the specters wander aimlessly, without a destination, heading nowhere among the ruins of Persepolis, the film refuses to show the beheading of Sīyāvash, that is to say, his ultimate heading in Férydoun's story. Eventually, the binding of the two worlds refuses to affirm the progression of a dialectics. Rather than Eisenstein's theory, Rahnéma's approach is closer to the kind of alienation and defamiliarization that Siegfried Kratochvíl advocates in his theory of film. This is the last few sentences. Thank you for your attention. Just a minute. This is an apostrophe. A decade after Rahnéma's films, in the ceremonial opening of the 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire, and in the presence of members of royal families and heads of states from across the world, facing the tomb of Cyrus, Mohammad Reza Shah announced, quote, "Cyrus, today in front of your eternal resting place, we have gathered to tell you, rest in peace, for we are awake," end quote. The announcement opens with a strong poetic apostrophe, assuring Cyrus of the prosperity of his land and urging his specter, albeit politely, to continue to rest, for there is a new sovereign protecting Iran from an Iran. The importance of this historical anecdote is in its contrast to Rahnéma's film, as also underlined by Golberger Hauntologies. While the 2,500-year celebration attempted to invoke Cyrus's specter of the past, only to conjure it away and thereby affirm the self-same identity of a present sovereign, Rahnéma's film, on the contrary, deconstructs the idea of the present with itself, of a present, that is self-present, rendering the identity of the sovereign impossible and foregrounding frictions into political fiction of national identity in modern Iran. I'm going to stop here and hopefully we can continue our conversation during the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Faridi, for your outstanding presentation and really thought-provoking. Just to warm everyone up for a fruitful conversation, I just want to go back to this final setting and image that you ended with. And this is the 1971 celebration of 2500th anniversary. While I respect Rahnéma's autonomy from the politics of the celebration, it is really important historically to recognize that from the 1940s, there were discussion of celebrating the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. And I am confident, without any documentation, that Rahnéma was very familiar and knew what was happening. And I'm wondering to what extent Siavash در Takht-e Jamshīd, or his work on Takht-e Jamshīd, was informed by this preparation for the 2500th anniversary celebration.
That's an excellent question, and also in some ways it speaks to the methodology of my work as well. I think that Farbad Hunarpishe has a reading of in his Ph.D. dissertation. There's a close reading of Persepolis, and one of the things that he mentions in that chapter is that basically, I mean, the close reading is quite interesting. I do encourage you to read that close reading, but it also that section also situates Rahnéma's work precisely in the context of that discourse, that notion of return to a pre-Islamic Iran. He also, and I think that is correct, He also mentioned that it's also kind of belated, because by the 1960s and 70s, there's also a shift to an Islamic, a kind of mystical Islamic identity during the Pahlavi period. And some of our friends, I don't know, Hamid Yousefi is here, and he's also working on that context. But so that's how he situates this film. Now, his close reading shows actually there are interesting stuff happening in Rahnéma's Persepolis. Nevertheless, and I agree, yes, that's the context. And the fact that Rahnéma goes to Persepolis shows something. It could be even belated, because again, it's been since that discourse of return to pre-Islamic Iran has been there since Reza Shah or Reza Khan. So that could be even belated. However, what I would say is that I am, while acknowledging that, I am less interested in what was the motivation for the quote-unquote historical figure Rahnéma to go to Persepolis and do this. Rather, I'm much more interested in the text itself, in the sense that the text is actually riddled with aporias. And that is true about Persepolis, that is true about Siavash در تخت جمشید, and also his پسر ایران از مادرش بی اطلاع است. And I see that Professor Saljouri is here, so I'm happy that she's here, and she has a brilliant close reading of that text. And there are aporias. I'm much more interested, rather than relating, because of these historical connections that you correctly noted, rather than connecting Rahnéma to that discourse, I'm much more interested in the aporias within this text, right? And the way that we should let the text to deconstruct itself. And that is what I've tried to do, precisely because the other way of approaching it, and that is something that, for instance, if you look at Hamid Nafisi, who is again another brilliant reading of, and showing that what's the importance of Rahnéma's influence institutionally on filmmaking in Iran. But if you look at his reading, you'll see that there is a notion of nostalgia. He assigns a notion of nostalgia about a pre-Islamic Iran to this, or he attributes that notion. And I think that we can, if we attend to the text, if we let the specters do their wild things, we can actually, we can think about the productive aspects of these ambiguities. And methodologically, this is what I've tried to do throughout my book and my in different chapters, reading closely text and showing these kind of tensions, these senses of ambiguity. You're absolutely correct. There is that connection there.
Thank you very much. Professor Saljouri, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yes. Thank you so much, Professor Faridi, for that wonderful talk. I am really excited about your work and happy that we had a chance to connect finally. So I have a couple questions for you, but once I just wanted to make a comment about this whole question of Nafisi's treatment of this sort of multiple temporalities, or this fascination with, or just the presence of earlier historical periods in the films as nostalgia, because I think there's also a non-national context in which to consider these multiple temporalities. And to me, that non-national context is what's happening in this post-World War II, Cold War era culture of basically a search for alternative modes of identity, whether they are kind of conceived in terms of like a universal subject or a national identity. And this return to the past, I think, can also be seen as this ripple of global interest in alternatives for different modes of living, right? I'd be curious what you think about that, but that was just a comment. That's not really my question for you. My question for you is, and I love, by the way, the what you do with Rahnéma's theory of montage and relationality. That's great. I would love to talk to you about that more. But I'm curious about the relation between literature and cinema, how the two kind of come together in terms of how you're understanding this period, this broad period, and actually how you've kind of settled on the period. And, you know, in the materials that Professor Tavakkoli sent around, you frame all of this in terms of decoloniality, and I think that's really exciting. And I do the same in my work, but I just want to hear you talk about that. And if you can indulge me with one final question for you, you mentioned your methodology, and I would love to hear you say more about this textual approach in terms of the intervention it's making, or other aspects of your methodology that are not just about textuality, in terms of just the field currently of cinema and media studies in Iran. Because as I'm sure you know, there's been debate within this series about this question at other talks about kind of this tension, this resistance to interpretation and textuality that's not just specific to Iranian cinema studies, but is kind of in that discipline at large. So how do you deal with that, if at all?
Thank you so much. So there is a lot. I am to begin with the idea of identity, this search for alternative modes of identity that you mentioned, which is quite interesting. And I think that partially Férydoun Rahnéma is actually underlining that. The notions of authenticity, right? So especially in the post-1953 coup moment, when there's a shattering of these ideals of a universal, universal revolutionary class that I just discussed in the first part of my presentation, there is that sense of quest for authenticity. I agree with that. I would say that, again, going back to the text and letting the aporias of the text to play themselves out, if that's a thing, is a way to think about the non-identical, and that is very important, because I situate also in my work, I situate the discourses of authenticity and alternative modes of identity also to projects of modernity. So even the decolonial notions of what is the authentic Iranian, it could be Islamic now, return to a mystical notion of in after 1960s that turned to mysticism. That could be an authentic Iranian, or the pre-Islamic authentic self, and etc. So I would say that all these are based on the logic, that is to say, there's a metaphysical logic at work. And all these formulations are based on ideas of identity or self-identical subjects, sovereignty, and etc. that also were colonially imported, partially at least, to Iran. So, and that is precisely why my reading is much more interested in the ways that we can think about the non-identical, a politics of non-identical. In other words, if we defines the political as the relation of the sovereign subjects, if we define the human rights, modern laws, and etc., rule of law, and etc., based on the relations of sovereign subject, then what kind of political we can think in the context of the non-identical? That is to say, departing from that notions of identity. So rather than now Western identity, or and I do this in the context of Persepolis specifically. When I look at the site, I do a close reading. I know that you're very well familiar with that film. I do a close reading of these the graffiti on the Gates of Nation by Sir Henry Morton, and then one by Mirzadeh Ishqi. Mirzadeh Ishqi, those of you who know modern Persian poetry, is a nationalist figure, highly nationalist figure, right? In terms of that project of national identity at the beginning of the 20th century. On the other hand, you have one of the worst representatives of the entire colonial enterprise, someone who also played a role in the we all know Heart of Darkness and the colonial projects in Congo, and he played a role in that. There's a graffiti. So these two are juxtaposed to each other. And my critique is toward both of them, because even though they're radically different, one is horribly colonial, the other one is nationalist against this colonial thing, presence, but at the same time, they're both based on the logic of identity, on a metaphysics of identity. And my reading of modernist poetry, starting with Nima Yushij and moving onward, and now I can move to your second question, is much more interested in this non-identical. And I'm not arguing that it is something that is there, because there is no such ontology. It is precisely against what I'm trying to argue. It is something that we can tease out through or foreground through certain practices of close reading. And that is exactly what I do with literature and cinema. So in the context of my book, I have a chapter on Shamdou. I have a long chapter which may turn into a separate book on Rahnéma, because I have close reading of his early poetry, his films, and then his later poetry, his surrealist phase. What happened, what I do is that I start with Nima Yushij, and this moment with Rahnéma is very important in my book, precisely because then some of the, and this is also in his notes, in Rahnéma's notes and writing about poetry, he adopts a certain certain poetic tropes from Nima Yushij, but not for his poetry. He used them for his theory of montage. And I've shown the relation between Nima Yushij's writing and his theory of poetic language and his practice of poetry, and the way that Rahnéma adopts some of these tropes for his philosophy of film and image. And again, I'm not interested in the historical subjectivity of Rahnéma itself. I'm much more focused on these texts. I also talk about his influence on immense influence on Shamdou. The preface to Shamdou's Qatnameh, which I translate as resolution, was written by Rahnéma. Rahnéma also financed the publication of that book. Although they had a dispute, and there was they eventually turned enemies in the decade after that. But Shamdou, especially if you look at Resolution and his poems such as Qaside Baraye Insan Mah Bahman, he is basically translating Rahnéma. Although poetically he's doing something interesting that Rahnéma does not do in his poetry. So I look at these historical connections, but I'm also much more interested in the translation of some of these tropes between poetry, modernist poetry, and cinema. And again, I also retrace some of these poetic moves in Nima Yushij. I'm not interested in the origin. I'm interested in the way that Nima Yushij draws on 17th century Tarz No and Tazegui to formulate a poetics in early 20th century. So I don't know if I responded to your question about literature and cinema, but I hope so. And the last one, decoloniality. The way that I look at the question of decoloniality is precisely first, and I owe this to Gulistan, Edouard Gulistan, in which he talks in his Poetics of Relation, he talks about a notion of decolonization as the getting rid of these notions or logics of identity. So decolonization for me is precisely then, it has to do with the critique of identity to begin with. And then we can think about colonial modernity in Iran as well. But it starts with a critique of the logic of identity. Sorry for the long response.
No, thank you so much for your thorough answer.
Thank you. Any other questions? Jane, please.
Yes, I was very interested about your comment about you were saying in the 60s and the 70s there was this association of national identity with Islamic mysticism. That to me was a little bit something, a new idea. There was certainly a lot of a sense of Jawan Mahdi and sort of like a populist Darwishi, but Islamic mysticism in the sense of trying to achieve tawheed or a mystical, transformation. I didn't really, I don't know, is that what you were talking about? What exactly did you mean?
Yes, and this is something that I have, some of my friends are currently working on. I think that I see that Maryam Atari, who is a PhD candidate in art history, is here, and maybe she knows better than me and she can respond better to this question. But if we look at the modernist art and avant-garde art after 1960s, there's a shift to certain mystical notions, or there's also a commercial shift, something that would sell in the art market, right? And again, Hamid Yousufi, another friend, his project is on this shift, and you can see that in the way that a group of avant-garde and modernist artists at the time adopts motifs from Sufism, both visual but also literary motifs from Sufism, and they adopt them in their works. So if you look at the works of Zendabudi, Parviz Tanawuli, and the others, you can find these some of these motifs. And what I'm saying is that that ideology of national identity was not also a unified thing. There was a return, an ideological return to the past, also triggered by Dr. Professor Tawakkoli Targhi has written about this, by certain combination of myth and history, but also by archaeological projects in the early 20th century Iran. But then also there was another shift, and that was not a radical rupture. They coexisted. But if you look at some of the modernist artwork during the time, which also were heavily supported by the court, they were drawing heavily not on ancient or pre-Islamic Iran, but on the Islamic motifs in their works.
Are you referring to the Sakakone movement?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I suppose takes on some of the symbols, but I wouldn't exactly call it Islamic mysticism, but
right, yeah,
that's not a term, I suppose.
Right.
Thank you.
And again, it's a very commercial also move in my opinion.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just a comment on this point of the emergence of Islamic mysticism. What is interesting is that in the writings starting from 1920s with Iran Shahr, particularly the journal Iran Shahr, there is this focus on the spiritual continuity of Iran. And then in 1940s, when the whole question of divisive conception of pre-Islamic and identified with Aryanism and Islamic Iran poses a political problem, a group of Iranians, particularly within the Farhangistan Zaban, come to articulate a spiritual continuity between pre-Islamic Iran and this pre-Islamic and Islamic Iran. So the Zarrin Kub's concept of Tasamuh Kurushi is grounded on this spiritual continuity, which allows for flourishing of Islamic spirituality and the focus on ancient Iran, because they see this as a continuity. I mean, these are really interesting problems for the 1950s and 1960s, and competing horizons of the future, and also competing perspective conceptions of ancient Iran, Islamic Iran, how they converge, come together, or collide. And I'm really, I really need to re-examine this Takht-e Jamshīd and see where Rahnéma stands. How does he figure into this constellation of perspectives on ancient, on Islamic Iran, and the future of Iran? But thank you. I think, Negar, you had a question there?
Yes. Hello, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. So I'm asking this because I think I maybe misunderstood. So if I understood correctly, Rahnéma's montage of fact and fiction, he's placing myth or fiction in a historical site. So I'm asking, is he doing it? He does that to the aim of alienation or defamiliarizing us, let's say, like this, because you said it's he is doing it to the aim of alienating us and defamiliarizing us. But I want to ask, in your reading, is he doing it to, let's say, alienate us from demarcating a historical identity, or to show like the ambiguity that is placed within historical narratives? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Are you okay? So yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, I'm here.
For that question. First, I think I would in general avoid the language of Rahnéma doing something. So all that I've been describing and I've been trying to underline is what the text does. So it is not Rahnéma's aim. In fact, going back to what Professor Tabakoi Taraghi was just saying, Rahnéma himself was very much interested, and in his writing, if you look at his essays, he's very much interested in the idea of a continuity of a people. That is to say, also, we need to investigate the metaphysical foundation of this continuity. What does it mean that the continuity of a people, of an identity? So he was very much invested in that, and he wrote about it. So what I'm arguing first, it's about the text. It's about trying to underline, foreground, and in an act of reading, tease out certain aspect of the text. So this is one point, and you're correct. So in that sense, I would say the effect of montage and what he does in the way that he uses a certain form of editing is the production of a sense of defamiliarization and ambiguity. So this sense of defamiliarization and ambiguity is precisely that which the ideological discourses, they try to avoid. They try to create this closed narrative that this is the glorious past, we need to return to that, and etc. So the past becomes a closed text, even though it changes, it constantly changes that meaning of the past. But in each iteration, past is created as this ontological text, as something that has an ontology we can recreate, and there is a sense to it, and we can return to it. What the film does, or at least parts of the film does, is that it creates and generates a sense of ambiguity. And I'm interested in the political, some of the political functions or ways in which we can theorize this ambiguity in alternative ways. So yes, you're correct. Very, very briefly, the film does that. It creates
Thank you so
ambiguity.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was very informative.
Thank you. Maziar John, outstanding, really, really interesting. I enjoyed it tremendously. I think it would be really good to see how the notion of sovereign subjects that you raised is really interesting. And to see how the whole notion of sovereign subject works with the political sort of environment of the time, where he was intervening. He was definitely, I think there must have been, do you know whether he got any funding for the production of these films from anyone?
It's interesting because, as you know, his family was very much connected. They were part of the political system in Iran in the 20th century. His father was, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was I'm not sure if he was an ambassador in France, so he was very much connected. He was, in fact, the source of funding, actually. He supported Shamlu. He also started different centers and programs, and Professor Nafisi and Rekab Talawi, they have written about this. So he has started different foundations and programs, and through these foundations, very important modernist works of cinema were created. So if I knew that, this is also I had a long interview with Férydoun Rahnéma, Férydoun's sister, and what she told me was that he often struggled for money, and that is precisely the subject of his last film. It's about a director who wants to create a piece of theater, but then he doesn't have enough money, and the actors are quitting, and there's a rebellion against him. So so he did a struggle with money and resources. His films took years to finish, and the last one was not even actually finished. It was he basically died of a very short time after it came out. He had a tumor in his brain. So his sister Férydoun Rahnéma did the subtitles, and they had a rush screening of the film at Cinémathèque Française in Paris. And that's why he only produced also 3 films. So he struggled with resources, but at the same time, his family was very much connected and part of the system. So he came from a privilege in that sense, a privileged background, and but whether he was directly funded by, I haven't seen anything to that effect in the documents. In fact, much of the documents are about the fact that he was constantly struggling with money to secure enough funding for his sometimes ambitious films that wouldn't, eventually he didn't have enough time, enough money and resources to create these ambitious films. So he has struggled with money, and I haven't seen anything to that effect. On the other hand, he was connected, and he was a very influential family.
But that connection also gives a lot of autonomy to the person. It doesn't mean that you become sort of the servant of the regime, but actually
that's
a lot of political
correct.
and a lot of cultural autonomy to break away.
That was, as you mentioned, I think that was also part of what happened in with many of the new wave films in Iran. They were supported by the government. Kanun Parvarish Fikri Kudakan, supported by the government, also, and and that is ambiguous politics is quite interesting. And that's why I constantly try to differentiate the text from the guy, from Férydoun Rahnéma.
Right.
I am very conscious.
The autonomy of the work, in a sense.
Exactly. I think that this is something that has been often ignored. Often the person really overshadow the text. And for instance, in Professor Nafisi, there's no close reading of the text. There's no close engagement. Some general arguments and about Rahnéma.
The text is reduced to the author.
Yes, yeah. So that is, and because it's such a common thing in Iranian studies and in literary studies, as well as in other fields, that's why I think that I've been really consciously trying to, even sometimes in an extreme way, but I've been very much consciously trying to say, I'm going to do a close reading of the text and show you all these amazing things that are happening in the text, but we often actually forget.
Actually, I think the originality of the two films on Takht-e Jamshīd would become much more evident if you take a look at everything that was being said in the 1960s in preparation for 2500th anniversary about Takht-e Jamshīd, about ancient Iran, about the connection to the past. Right. And that will show, in a sense, the originality of the text, or
it will actually show better the paradoxes of this text. Yeah. I actually do that in the. We didn't have enough time, obviously, to do this in this context. But in the chapter, I have long discussions of the discourses of nationalism, the return to ancient Iran, and the archaeological projects in Persepolis. I engage with all those discourses precisely to show that then the potentials of the film. So what I'm saying is that it's not a divorce from the historical. It's rather trying to make sure that the text is not subsumed or kind of cannibalized by again by the figure. If I want to do that, if I want to read, and it's interesting, and I do that. If you read some of Rahnéma's essays, they sound very nationalist. The fact that his pen name in France was Kaveh Tabaristani is significant. Why Kaveh? Why Tabaristan? It's a very highly nationalist pen name to choose. But
the nationalist of a particular type, though.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
It's a Kaveh.
With his leftist socialist orientation of the 1950s. And then the question becomes whether he has also gone through some sort of political reorientation or not.
That's what I've tried to. That's exactly what I've tried to address, the paradox that in Iran, people often think of Rahnéma as this highly avant-garde, very apolitical figure. Right. And he was attacked. He was actually attacked by some of the poets, some of the artists, that he's non-committed, therefore he's pro-regime, right? Right. But what so that's how he has been accused in his context in Iran. But people do not know that this is the same person that wrote all these. I mean, if you look at some of his early poetry, there's like all this praise of Engels and Marx and Stalin, and so it's a very different world. Yeah. I ask what happens textually if we think about all these texts together. What happened? And I argue that there was a movement he was, my argument is that he remained political, but political in a different sense.
Political,
or the texts are
really
political
important.
in a very different sense.
Yeah.
Before it was a metaphysical identity, a metaphysical Marxist identity, identity of a revolutionary class. That is gone. Now, if the movement toward the non-identical is itself a political movement.
Yeah.
But what kind of politics we need to
subject
think? Yeah, exactly.
that cannot be collectivized.
Yeah.
And singular.
Or a critique of sovereignty, and precisely a critique of sovereignty. So that's what I'm interested in, and I'm trying to do.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Give us the opportunity to listen to your work.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So hopefully, I mean, we'll be in touch once. If you get a chance to look at the article, let's have another meeting.
Yeah, definitely. And I have a piece which is called, I think, Civilizational Turn, or the Persian version is چرخش تمدنی و تسامح کوروشی, and it's about these contestations of the 1940s and 50s, and then linking the Cyrus Cylinder to Human Rights Declaration. Really, really interesting, but there are diverged views that are emerging during that period. And it will give you some things to play with, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, I haven't seen this, so I'll
send it
check this out. Yeah,
I'll send it. Yeah.
Where is that? Can I find it?
It was published in Iran.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's available if you Google it.
Yeah.
چرخش تمدنی و تسامح کوروشی.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
And تسامح کوروشی comes from Zarrin Koob, who wrote, actually, what is interesting, دو قرن سکوت.
Yes. Yeah.
The politics of دو قرن سکوت is very different from the politics of تسامح کوروشی. تسامح کوروشی focuses on spiritual continuity of ancient Iran in Islamic Iran.
The other one is about rupture.
Yeah, radical rupture. Yeah.
Radical rupture.
Yeah.
That's correct. That's
and Zarrin Koob was also politically very active, was a leftist in his early part of his political life, which parallels that of Rahnéma, actually.
That's very interesting. I'll definitely check that out. Thank you so much.
Please join me to thank Dr. Faridi for his outstanding and thought-provoking presentation. And we look forward to the publication of the book.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much also for giving me the opportunity and for all the excellent and wonderful questions. I really appreciate it. And also it's so great to meet Professor Sarjouhi. I've been engaged with her work and I have referenced her a lot in my work, and it's great to finally meet you in virtually though, but yeah, it's great to meet you here.
Likewise, let's be in touch.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Dr. Faridi, thank you also for accepting our invitation during this difficult and very busy period of your life. And I hope everything goes well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Everyone, have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a good day.